Good morning, students. Today we are going to start with short run equilibrium output. Let's first understand the meaning of short run and then we'll go into the concept of equilibrium. Short run is that time period where level of production in the economy depends upon the level of employment, which means more output can be produced by employing more of a labor. More employment, more output, less employment, less output, and technology is assumed to be constant here. It has no role to play in the production activities. That shorter time period is called short run. Only will be considering the total production dependent on total level of employment. Now, what do we mean by equilibrium? Equilibrium means balance, and equilibrium output means total production, that level of production where supply fulfills the demand. This is also called equilibrium GDP or equilibrium income because, as we learnt in the unit of national income, output means GDP and GDP is the total income of the economy. So, that level where aggregate supply equals the aggregate demand, that is referred to as equilibrium level of output. As understood before also, let us recapitulate what is aggregate demand and what is aggregate supply. Aggregate supply refers to planned level of production in the economy, desired level of production in the economy. It is not the actual production. This is the level of GDP that producer plan to produce or they wish to produce. This is also known as ex ante aggregate supply or ex ante AS. Aggregate demand or AD, on the other hand, refers to the level of income, level of GDP, which buyers wish to spend. They do wish to expend, do the expenditure in buying the goods and services during an accounting year. So this planned expenditure is called ex ante aggregate demand or ex ante AD. Now, what the producers wish to produce when it is exactly equal to what the buyers wish to buy, that is referred to as equilibrium. Means a point where aggregate supply equals the aggregate demand is equilibrium level of output. And there is no excess production, no shortage of output. This brings a balance between AS and AD. As flashed on your screens, you can see a time period where aggregate demand equals to aggregate supply, and this aggregate supply is also referred to as income. So Y denotes income and Y equals to AS, as already we have learnt previously. AS can also be written as income. So a point where aggregate supply equals to aggregate demand or where income equals to aggregate demand, that is the level of equilibrium. Now let us see what is equilibrium GDP. As I told you beforehand also, you can see here on your screens, AS is equal to AD can also be written as Y equals to AD. Secondly, actual stock of the producers in this case of equilibrium, actual production will be equal to actual demand. But in case if it happens differently, see here, if aggregate supply is more than aggregate demand, what will happen? It means income is more than aggregate demand. Here, producers will have to suffer losses. Reason being that supply is more and excessive stocks of unsold goods will accumulate. On the other hand, if aggregate supply is less than aggregate demand, you can see here on your screens, what will happen? Actual stocks are falling short of what are required by the general public. So again the producers will suffer loss because of the unfulfilled demand in the economy. This will be the situation when producers will have an opportunity to earn more profit by selling more, but production is falling short of and they cannot get the profit. They'll suffer the loss on account of unfulfilled demand in the economy. This is one approach which is also referred to as aggregate demand, aggregate supply and aggregate demand approach of equilibrium. Another approach of equilibrium is where savings equals to investment. This also you can see on your screens. It's very comfortable for you to understand. See here, as I told you, AS is equal to AD in the state of equilibrium. This can also be written as Y equals to AD. What do we do? What is this Y? Y denotes the income in the economy. So Y means income. Income is either consumed or it is spent. We can also write it as Y is equal to C plus S. Income is either consumed or it is spent. On the other hand, aggregate demand in an economy, as it is a two-sector model, AD is equal to C plus I. Now referring to the equation of the equilibrium, where we understood aggregate demands equals to aggregate supply, this can be written as this way: aggregate demand is equal to C plus I and aggregate supply, that is income, is equal to C plus S. Cancelling both C's, where we reach S is equal to I. It means a point where savings are equal to investment. Whatever the common people have in excess and they save in the banks, same amount is used by the producer which they get from banks in the form of loan, and savings become equal to investment. So we can say that equilibrium is a situation with two approaches. One is where aggregate demand equals to aggregate supply, and second approach is where savings become equals to investments. These are the two approaches. Today we'll elaborate one approach, that is aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach. Another thing is ex ante saving and ex ante investment. What do we mean by this? These are planned savings and planned investment, and they do not include the actual savings or actual investment. Ex post saving and ex post investment are the actual saving and actual investment. This is for your consideration. Do remember and note, ex ante means what we are planning and ex post means what is actually happening in the economy. Now let us understand one approach today, that is aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach. As per this approach, how the equilibrium is achieved in the economy. We are assuming here that price is going to remain constant. So equilibrium GDP or equilibrium income is achieved at a point where aggregate demand equals to aggregate supply, as already explained to you. Now how to create this aggregate supply curve and how to depict aggregate supply function in a graph, as explained earlier, you have to draw x and y axis, where income is to be taken on x axis and supply will be taken on y axis. Draw a 45-degree line. Now at every point of this 45-degree line, we see, since this has divided the graph into two equal parts, therefore at every point of this line, income and aggregate supply are equal. This is how we make the curve for aggregate supply function. Now second is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand, since this is a two-sector model, so aggregate demand will be C plus I. It's not a four-sector model. Otherwise, aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus M. But since it is a two-sector model, so therefore we have only two components here, C plus I. That is aggregate demand in a two-sector economy. So AD refers to desired expenditure in the economy during an accounting year. Moreover, another thing to be remembered, as learnt earlier, the relationship between consumption and income is positive. More income leads to more consumption and less income leads to less consumption. Also, at zero level of income, still there is some minimum level of consumption, which is called autonomous consumption and is denoted by C bar. Now let us plot the investment function and consumption function C plus I on a graph. First we will be plotting the investment. Since we are considering a short run equilibrium here, so short run equilibrium means that point, short run means that time period in the economy where output or Production is entirely depending upon the level of employment in the economy, and it has nothing to do with technology. Assuming this, we come to the point, means even if the income is zero, still the producers have invested 20 rupees. If income increases, it goes on increasing. Producer does not increase the production, since does not increase the technology, and does not purchase more machinery, since this is a short time period. So investment is assumed to be constant at 20. So whatever be the income, investment is going to remain constant. Therefore, this I curve is parallel to x axis because the investment is considered to be autonomous. This is one component of aggregate demand. Second component of aggregate demand is C. As I told you, AD is equal to C plus I. And I, we have already learned, this is constant. Now about C. The relationship between income and consumption is positive. And there is some level of consumption even at zero level of income. So this consumption line is starting from 30. Investment is constant. This is what we learned in the previous figure. Therefore, now to denote C, we see because the relationship between income and consumption is constant and it is positive. Therefore, it starts from 30 at zero level of income. Autonomous consumption is 30, and accordingly as the income increases, consumption is also going on increasing. This is showing the positive relationship between consumption and income in the economy. So this is how we draw the consumption function. Now plotting all the components together, let us see how the equilibrium is achieved. This is the investment function, that is parallel to x-axis. Then I, consumption function, which is positively related with the income. More the income, more is the consumption, and therefore this is upward sloping. Now aggregate demand, how it will be plotted? Aggregate demand equals to C plus I, and I is constant. So therefore aggregate demand curve will be parallel to C curve as shown in the figure. This pink line depicts that aggregate demand is parallel to consumption function. This table shows the positive relationship between the income and consumption, as you can see in the figure. See, income is increasing with a gap of 20 each, means from 20 to 40 it is increasing, then to 60, 80, 100, 120 and so on. So this increase in income is constantly increasing. Relationship between income and consumption is positive. With an increase in income, consumption is also increasing, but as depicted in the table, you can just see that increase in income is with a gap of 20 each. On the other hand, increase in consumption is with a gap of 10 each. Rate of increase in income is always more than rate of increase in consumption, that we have already learned in our previous lectures. Secondly, when we talk about the investment remains constant as just understood. This is a short run. It's a short time period. So in this short time period, investment is constant because entire production is dependent upon the level of employment in the economy. Adding both these, C plus I, we get aggregate demand because it's a two sector model. So now aggregate demand is C plus I. We keep on adding the values and we come to the aggregate demand. That is the last column here. Depicting the same graphically, what do we understand now? That aggregate demand curve will start at a level above 0. Last but not the least, now we'll come to the conclusion. What happens if aggregate supply is more than aggregate demand? There will be a stock of unsold goods will remain with the producers, and further the producers will have to plan less of production till aggregate supply becomes equal to aggregate demand. On the other hand, when aggregate supply is less than aggregate demand, producers will suffer the loss of unfulfilled demand. They will have the opportunity to earn more profit, but they are not able to because the aggregate supply is less than aggregate demand. Accordingly, they will plan to produce more in future till they reach the equilibrium point where aggregate demand becomes equal to aggregate supply. So this is your aggregate demand and aggregate supply approach, and tomorrow we'll start with the saving and investment approach. Thank you all.